The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept. Together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out.
It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9-to-5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it.
The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept. Together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT. The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept. Together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT.
It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9-to-5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it. It's that thrill of a new opportunity, of shared connection, of wrapping your head around how it all works. It's closing the pitch on a game-changing idea, the late nights spent with your teammates, and how industry shapes the world with each disruption, innovation, twist and turn. When we talk about business, it's more than just outdated corporate notions. It goes beyond water cooler conversations, 9-to-5s or profit and loss. It's fighting for the social and environmental impact of commercial decisions. It's learning the right questions to ask. It's finding the glass ceiling and breaking through. When we say business, we mean new models of enriched economies at local and global scale. We mean what's next for future skills, technology and beyond. When we say business, we mean it.
The future is unwritten, so what comes next is ours to write. We are the game changers, hands-on with real-world impact. We redesign the room and reimagine the concept. Together, limited by nothing. Because when you write the future, there's always another page. So, what's next? Find out at RMIT.
Welcome. Welcome to the second of our free cybersecurity thought leadership webinars hosted by RMIT University. My name's Matt Warren. I'm the director of the RMIT Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation, and I'm a professor of cybersecurity here at the College of Business and Law at RMIT University. I'm delighted to host today's webinar and to moderate a panel discussion between two high-calibre industry and government experts, Dr. Tobias Ferguson and Dr. Craig Emerson. Now, before we begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Wuyang and Buyang language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. So in terms of today's in terms of the webinar series, it's looking at the concept around keeping Australia cyber secure in 2021. This past year, due to COVID-19, we've seen a rapid increase in digitalization of both Australian businesses and our everyday lives, with more of us working and shopping online. And, you know, the impact of COVID-19, we just have to turn on the news to see, you know, the new impact it's having, you know, upon us in Australia. So what we're seeing is a trend in terms of increased online scans and cybercrime. And we've seen, you know, in the past few weeks, disruptions of our major banks, even, you know, supply chain in terms of meat production. So again, what we're seeing is that cybersecurity is no longer just something that's in the domain of the IT department. It's everyone's concern, from the boardroom through to the frontline worker, through to us as individual citizens. So in this series, we're covering three major topics. We've started by looking at critical infrastructure. And there's a recording of that in our YouTube channel, and that link will be shared later. So again, that talks about the importance of critical infrastructure and how it has to be protected, you know, to ensure, continued operation of government and industry here in Australia. Today, for our second seminar, we're very excited to be discussing cyber and critical technology and the need to collaborate on this in the Indo-Pacific region. Our third and final webinar, which is taking place next week, will be talking on the very topical subject of ransomware. So if you've not already done so, please make sure you use the QR code on the slide to secure a ticket to that last webinar. So you can book through the slide. There'll also be, you know, follow-up information about the event as well. So earlier this year, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT, launched Australia's International Cyber and Critical Technology Engagement Strategy. This strategy builds on the 2017 International Engagement Strategy. The 2021 strategy defines critical technologies as those technologies with the capability to significantly enhance or pose risks to Australia's national interests, including our prosperity, social cohesion, and national security. There is no doubt that the Indo-Pacific region has the potential to drive more productive and efficient economies, and technology and the use of technology is a key driver of that. And hence the reason, that Australia is looking to cooperate to that region in terms of cyber and critical technologies to ensure the whole region will grow. At RMIT, we want to actively engage in international cooperation and collaboration with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. As part of this engagement, I'm very excited to announce that we are launching the Centre for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation Vietnam Hub later this year. The Vietnam Hub will contribute to building cooperation between Australia and Vietnam in the Indo-Pacific region in the domains of cybersecurity and critical technologies. I am very much looking forward to working closely with Dr. Pham Hip, and as I said, there'll be further information later about the official launch of this new Australian Vietnamese extension of our research centre. To give you a quick run through the agenda for today, we'll begin with brief introductions of our panel members, Dr. Tobias Ferguson and Dr. Craig Emerson, and then we'll dive straight into a panel discussion asking the question, why is cooperation with the Indo-Pacific region around cyber and critical technology important to Australia? I know that a lot of you are very excited for the discussions, and I'm sure that you have many questions that you would like to ask. So to give everyone a chance to engage with our panel, we will conclude the webinar with a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So in terms of the system, you're able to post your questions to the speakers. So I'd like you, to think about questions you'd like to submit via the Q&A chat function, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Craig Emerson. Dr. Craig Emerson is an eminent economist with 35 years experience in public policy, politics and public servants. He was Australia's Minister of Trade and Competitiveness from 2010 to 2013. Prior to that, he was the Minister for Small Business and Minister for Competition Policy and Consumer Affairs. Craig was the architect of the 2012 White Paper on Australia in the Asian Centre and was appointed Minister assisting the Prime Minister on Asian Century Policy. He is also a member of the Tertiary Education, Skills, Science and Research, a former Minister for Tertiary Education, Science and Research and Chair of the Productive Committee for Cabinet. Dr. Emerson was also an economic and trade advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke in the 1980s, and he also held positions of Assistant Secretary in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet Office, Director General of the Queensland Department of Environment and Heritage, and Policy Analyst at the United Nations in Bangkok. Dr. Emerson has a PhD in economics from the Australian National University and a Master's of Economics and a Bachelor of Economics from the University of Sydney. It's wonderful to have you with us today, Craig.
Just unmuting. Waiting for it to unmute.
Oh, wonderful to have you with us today, Craig.
Thank you.
I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Tobias Ferguson as well. Dr. Tobias Ferguson is Australia's inaugural Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. He commenced as Ambassador for Cyber Affairs in January 2017 before having his mandate expanded to reflect the central role that technology's issues now have in geopolitics. He leads Australia's whole of government international engagement to advance and protect Australia's national security, foreign policy, economic and trade and development interests in cyberspace and critical technology. Ambassador Ferguson was a member of the independent panel of experts that supported the Australia's cybersecurity review to produce Australia's initial 2016 cybersecurity strategy. Following that, he was involved in the creation of Australia's 2017 International Cyber Engagement Strategy. Prior to his ambassadorial appointment, Dr. Ferguson was a Director of National Security Programs at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute from 2012 to 2016, where he established the Institute's International Cyber Policy Centre. Prior to this, he was a Director for National Security and Resilience at the Royal United Service Institute in London, United Kingdom, from 2006 to 2012. Ambassador Ferguson is a Senior Fellow with the Royal United Service Institute and a member of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace advisory group, which focuses on developing an international strategy for cybersecurity and the global financial system. Ambassador Ferguson holds an honours degree in security studies and a doctorate of philosophy in international politics and security studies, both from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. Welcome, Tobias.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here.
So I'd like to really open up with a number of questions. And the first question is really, why is cooperation across our region on cyber and critical technologies so essential to the security of Australia, Vietnam, and more broadly, the Indo-Pacific region? And Tobias, I may just start with yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. Really good question to kick us off, I think. I mean, put quite simply, and I'm sure that's why the majority of people are here to watch this webinar today, it's hard to escape the fact that cyberspace and critical technologies have become such a geopolitically contested issue, and hard to escape a headline or news reporting of either a cyber incident. You mentioned a few of those, Matt, in your introductory comments, whether it be the Colonial Pipeline issue or a whole range of other examples that you could point to, or to the fact that critical technology areas are becoming even more contested in the trade environment as well, which all point towards the fact that we need to be prioritizing them as a foreign policy issue. Now, in our region, what we have is a region of extremes in many respects. Certainly when you look at the digital environment, we have some of the most hyper-connected, digitally advanced countries anywhere on the planet, but we equally have some of the least connected countries anywhere on the planet. So that leads to disparities in terms of economic development cycles, of national security provision, and the ability to exploit the digital environment for economic benefit. So it's really important that Australia is on the front foot in terms of engaging with our partners in the region to ensure that, from a security perspective, we are ensuring that we are connected, we are talking, we're trying to ensure that we don't get into any situations of miscalculation, misinterpretation, and potentially difficult issues in cyberspace, especially. And we do that through a whole range of means, whether it be through our bilateral discussions with countries around the region, whether it be through the ASEAN intersessional meetings, which focus on cyber-related issues. We're really progressing work much further along the line now in terms of ensuring that countries are cognizant of international law and how it applies, how norms of responsible state behavior apply to countries in the region. And also we're seeing increasingly the importance of countries in our region in terms of engaging into that broader United Nations discussion where so much of this has taken place. Now, it's no good having those conversations if some of our less connected partners cannot engage in that. So therefore, it's important that we also assist other countries in our region engage in that conversation. So ensure that they have the right skills and right knowledge and be able to actually, well, previously physically engage, but now would be, technically engage in those discussions via VTC, so that they're playing their role in that discussion in terms of creating a better security architecture in our region. And then, quite simply put, Australia's security benefits from uplifting the cybersecurity and the resilience to technology shifts if our region is better equipped as well. So we spend a lot of time and effort, and if anyone's interested to dig into the new international cyber and critical tech engagement strategy, we lay out some of this in that strategy. We do a lot of work in the region in trying to create better cyber resilience amongst our partners, both technically from a policy point of view, but also equip countries to engage in this rapidly evolving critical technology space, which is shaping all of our economies and lives directly now, and will ever more so over the next 50 years or so. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing. And if you place that into the broader geostrategic environment in our region as well, I think that pretty much speaks for itself. If you reflect what you see go on in the physical world and a lot of that competition that we see play out in so many different ways and manifests in so many different ways in our region, certainly that's reflected in the cyber and tech environment. So we need to be on the front foot. We need to be engaging and ensuring that we're in the middle of that conversation. And I'm pleased to say that's what we do. And we do it with a great deal of transparency in terms of the positions that we put forward. We think by promoting a clearer conversation, whether it be about offensive cyber capabilities, whether it be about better cybersecurity practice, and the broader international legal and normative settings, in that way, we will help create a more resilient region, which benefits Australia as well. And the final part of that equation I'll say before I hand back to you, Matt, is about the cyber crime issues that we see in our region as well, because that's an also ever increasingly important part of the way that we increase the resilience of the region. We know it's becoming an increasing focus and target of cyber criminals. We know that there's increasing manifestation of that issue through the various crime syndicates that operate in our region. And as we're now seeing, cyber crime issues can very rapidly hit the geostrategic level conversation as well. As you have mentioned, cybersecurity issues can hit the individual all the way to CEOs. Now we see presidents and prime ministers discussing this issue on an incredibly regular basis. And that's where this conversation is now being placed at the absolute top strategic level, because countries now acknowledge that's where the conversation needs to begin and trickle through the system from there. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Tobias. And Craig, drawing upon your vast experience of the Indo-Pacific region, why do you see sort of cooperation being so important, especially when we begin to talk about cooperation around technology and around cybersecurity and other forms of security?
Well, the whole purpose of APEC, and I'm the director of the APEC Study Centre at RMIT, is economic integration. It's that you get more from the sum of the parts than you would just by counting each one individually. And that has been the story and the success story of the region, is that integration. Now, I suppose we could discuss how far into the digital age we are, but certainly probably the turn of the century really did mark the dawning of the digital age. We're now 20 years in, if we use that as some sort of starting point. And I think 20 years hence, what people would be doing looking back at us, I think they'd say, gee, it was pretty rudimentary, given the changes that are underway. And we have to be not lagging those changes. If we're going to have that ongoing integration, we need to be part of the change, not just a follower of the change. And so through a proper cyber program of cooperation, we'll have more confidence in doing that. And I do also reflect on the fact that when COVID hit, we were all forced online. And I personally don't think that's going to abate too much, assuming the virus does abate, because it has a lot of conveniences. Think of the travel that it saves in terms of, for example, Australians going to various countries of the region. It's enormously time saving, but at the same time, it allows anyone potentially to listen in or to interfere in the conversations that otherwise we would be having in person. And that comprises two categories, probably state actors from around the world and also criminals, as we've just heard. So in terms of being able to be confident in having conversations and in swapping vitally important information, for example, in capacity building programs, you'd want to be sure, as sure as you possibly could, that there's not interference with those on the way through any of those actors. So in a sense, we're more connected, but we're more vulnerable to interference. And that's why I think the cybersecurity exercise that we're talking about here and the whole program is so vitally important.
Excellent. Thank you, Craig. Tobias, I'd like to talk more about the 2020 strategy. So we've seen, the development of the 2017 Australian International Cyber Engagement Strategy. We've seen that involved into the 2021 International Cyber and Critical Technology Engagement Strategy. So why have we seen a broadening to include critical technologies? And what do you also see as a major difference between the 2017 and the 2021 strategy?
Sure, thanks, Matt. I think largely the underpinnings of both strategies are very similar in the sense that, we're essentially looking for the best playing field possible for Australia, in the first instance, our partners in the region, and as globally equitable as can be. But I think what the difference between the two was, if in 2017, if it was the first task I had when I was in this position. I started in January 2017, and the first job was to create an international engagement strategy around how we engaged on cyber affairs and cyber affairs writ large. So cybersecurity being one part of that, but how do we ensure that we get the most out of our digital trade arrangements? How do we ensure that we are playing in that international security environment? How do we combat cybercrime? How do we ensure that human rights are maintained online? And then how do we ensure that our development programs are firstly cognizant of cybersecurity in the first case, but then how do we deliver that to our partners around the region in the right way? And it was really reflective of the fact that cybersecurity issues were becoming prioritized, and the position that I hold came out of the 2016 strategy, where the government felt that it was important to have a senior level international representative who could prioritize Australia's international engagement in the right way on cyber affairs. Now, what became very quickly evident, especially I would say about a year and a half into this position, was that anecdotally, it was difficult to go and have a conversation with any partner country in any public forum when you were discussing cybersecurity issues or related associated issues, without there very quickly being some bolt-on technologies that became part of that conversation. And I'm sure, Matt, you found this as well. you know, there would very quickly be a leap to, well, what about machine learning and AI? Well, what about 5G technologies? And 5G still is a core part of so much of the international technology conversation. But I think Australia entering into that conversation in 2018 really changed the game in the sense of looking at new technologies which would fundamentally underpin your economy and your infrastructures for the foreseeable future. Really highlighted, I think, how these technology issues were shifting. So, you know, again, you can increase that technology landscape to quantum computing, blockchain, you know, there's a whole array of terms. Now, in the first instance, a lot of those technologies that were being discussed because they're either reliant on or build off of the architecture that cyberspace provides us. And I include in the architecture the data that cyberspace provides us and the users provide. Therefore, the linkages became very clear. And then it became very clear in the way that you saw policymaking being made around, certainly in and amongst the big superpowers, and the way that they were prioritizing these particular issues, investing in them. So it was a very logical progression that a position like this should begin to look at that broader tech landscape. Because if you didn't do that, you would essentially be missing parts of the jigsaw puzzle. These technologies are fundamentally going to shape the relationships between countries over the next 50 to 100 years. You know, future economies will be built and are being built off the back of these technologies. It's evident in the quantums of finance that are being put in them from a government perspective, from venture capital perspective. Therefore, if we are not in that conversation and trying to shape the way in which technology is being developed itself, and then B, shape the way in which technology is absorbed into the global settings, then you could easily find yourself in a position which is not particularly favorable to you. Therefore, if you like, progressing from a focus on cyber affairs to cyber and critical technology was very, very logical, in order that we could lay out very clearly from a government perspective, it's showing an understanding of the situation, and then how we intended to go about doing our bit to shape that environment in the right way. So from where I sit, and I know it's a very privileged position and involved in lots of, you know, very focused discussions on this, it's a very logical progression. But I think what it does is it shows how government fundamentally has shifted in the prioritization of cyber and tech issues now, in a way that, you know, when you mentioned that I started the International Cyber Policy Centre all those years ago, there was certainly nowhere near as many people working on these issues as there are now. And I think that shows, out of necessity, our strategic prioritization, the fundamental shift in the way that we're looking at these issues.
Thank you, Tobias, and thank you for really showing that development of the 2017 strategy, how it, you know, contributed then to the 2021 strategy and the rationale behind that. Craig, with your experience from an APEC perspective, Australia having a national engagement strategy, does that help our engagement with our neighbours in APEC and the wider Indo-Pacific region?
Well, yes, it does. And I suppose one way of looking at it is, or one dimension of it is soft diplomacy in the region. If we can strengthen cybersecurity, not only at home, but amongst those countries, then that's a good thing. The way I see it, it's an ongoing race, a race that never finishes, because the pace of technological change in the digital world is so rapid, and then you're going to have not very well motivated people, including criminals, wanting to be at least at that pace and ideally ahead. So this is not something that's going to be resolved, you know, once and for all. Well, I suppose you could argue, when you think, I'm going to use a very simple example of bank robberies. Banks worked out how to stop robbers, you know, coming through the front door with weapons and getting lots of cash. And so I don't think there's been a lot of bank robberies in Australia. In fact, I don't think there've been any of that type. But there's plenty of attempts to do it through digital means. and there's plenty of attempts to do that to just about anyone who's online who's got something of value. So I see that, you know, this is not an issue that will be resolved once and for all. It'll require essentially eternal vigilance. And if Australia can play a leading role in that, I think it's good for Australia, but it's also very good for the region. And the final thing you mentioned, I think in the introduction, JBS, you know, they produce a very tangible good, and that is meat. But that didn't stop their whole business being attacked, you know, subject to a cyber attack. And because everyone really who's running a business is online these days, that's an enabler, but it's also a vulnerability. And that's why I think these sorts of initiatives are so important, because that'll never, ever be resolved, you know, definitively. And one final thing, I just found it really fascinating to look at a program, and you mentioned this at the introduction, on deep fakes, you know, where you can have a US president, to all intents and purposes, speaking to the people, but it's just that he never did in those. But that's a technology that is now available, and I can easily see circumstances in countries of the Indo-Pacific where a lot of people are watching something online and they actually believe that a very senior leader is speaking to them, and it just may not be the case. It may be that that is a complete deep fake. So I'm just saying, you know, the challenges are enormous, and it's a good thing that you know, we're up for the challenge, that we've taken it on, and these sorts of programs through RMIT are very, very important in that endeavour.
Thank you, Craig. So one of the themes that's been quite common in sort of discussions is really, you know, the theme of COVID and the theme of diplomacy. And I suppose the next question I'll ask is, has COVID-19 changed the diplomatic relationship and landscape in relation to conversations with governments, or conversations with governments around cyber and critical technologies in the region, and also sort of globally? So Tobias, I know this is an area that you're involved with a lot, sort of talking to governments and bodies around the world.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Yeah, that's my job title as a diplomat, so I better get stuck into that one and tell you how my job has shifted since I last saw you. So the last time I actually travelled, I did see Matt on my travels, was in San Francisco last year, and I think it was late February. So you know, what's changed is that as diplomats, we are not travelling at the moment, in very rare occasions. I mean, I will say that one of the few pieces of travel that me or any of my team has done is our lead UN negotiator for the UN processes that have been taking place in New York. We did feel, with all of the right, you know, risk awareness around it and risk processes, we sent her to New York to do the discussions in person. But that is one of the only times that we've had, that is the only time of one of our diplomats traveling to deliver face-to-face discussions. And it shows you the magnitude of the discussions that are taking place in the UN at the moment. And I'm pleased with the outcomes. Anybody can have a look at, you know, the outcomes from the two bodies, the UN Group of Government Experts, just recently tied up in April, May this year, and the UN Group of Government Experts, where Australia played a very strong role. So, you know, what has diplomacy been through? I would suggest it's not too dissimilar to what the rest of the world has gone through, which is an incredibly rapid digitization of processes and interactions. I share the experiences, but perhaps slightly, maybe a few more than many on this call, of some very, very late nights, and the extension of the working day to accommodate your colleagues in various geographic locations. And suffice to say, as soon as you're out of the Indo-Pacific, you're often at the sharp end of the later hours, or you know, the early hours of morning, which is absolutely fine. So in some ways, the engagement has gone up because we've shifted to more of a, you know, VTC environment. There is almost that encouragement to be more regularly in contact with people. So, you know, I certainly don't feel that, you know, this area of diplomacy has suffered as a consequence. in many respects, because I've been in the position some time and knew the community very, very well, it's benefited the way that we've rolled out this area of diplomacy. We still conduct all of the regional engagements, if they're beyond the bilateral, through ASEAN and the like, or on VTCs. Now, Craig did mention a very important part of this conversation, that can't always be the case, because there are going to be parts of our conversation which can't take place on open platforms, and very necessarily so between governments. So certainly, for us in terms of our working practice, once we feel more in a position with the global settings to travel, that will begin to emerge. But I do think we've seen a fundamental shift that diplomacy, won't be quite as travel intensive as it was in the past. Now, one thing I should comment on as well is the changing threat environment that we saw across the Australian government in terms of cybersecurity risk. Perhaps not so much that we saw an enormous uptick in the frequency and intensity of the issues we were dealing with, but certainly we saw a retargeting and repurposing of particular tools to utilize COVID-19 as a mask, if you like, or a haze to which to deliver the end desired result. So we saw an uptick in spear phishing attempts which use COVID-19 language or spoofs to get into someone's account or into organizations' accounts. We did see an uptick in ransomware that was based around COVID-19 issues. But we also saw state and non-state actors targeting healthcare infrastructure. And that is particularly difficult to deal with or to accept during a time of increased reliance on the health sector. And certainly, we used a lot of diplomatic effort to make sure that our concerns were expressed both privately and also publicly on that front, to ensure that we were applying pressure, including through the UN. But we also saw how healthcare facilities were being targeted globally. And then furthermore, how misinformation, disinformation was being rolled out around the healthcare information for COVID-19. And again, if the information that you received during a pandemic is going to be pretty essential to whether you survive that pandemic, for us, that's pretty unacceptable that states or other actors are willing to spread disinformation during such periods. So you've seen a big uptick in the work that we're doing diplomatically and practically on that front to try and equip partners in that area of work. So it's been a rapid transformation, and I think in many respects you'll see diplomacy that is delivered in a whole multitude of ways now. It's certainly become, I think, more flexible, but there will always be a time and space for that face-to-face meeting where things can be said that otherwise wouldn't be the case on an open line.
Could I follow up on that, Matt?
Oh, of course, Craig, please.
The experience I've had, since COVID struck is obviously the quantity of diplomacy has actually risen, because notwithstanding the late nights, it's not a big deal to arrange a meeting of many countries, representatives of many countries, ministers, even leaders of countries, but the quality of it has probably fallen. And the reason for that is, as humans, we have a level of spontaneity about us. I was just using my hands to explain that. And when you're in the room with people, or even if you're having dinner or a cup of coffee or something, you get to know those people and you can have very ad hoc, impromptu conversations with them. That's really hard to do digitally. And I think we are missing that. It also means that when you think diplomatically, we've got some strained relations around our region, as we know, and sometimes the leader of another country won't want to meet or is reluctant to digitally. But when in 2012, Julia Gillard's dad passed away at the APEC meeting at Vladivostok, and I stepped into her position, I had more productive conversations just walking around in a room with leaders, having a cup of coffee, a bit of a break, getting to know them a bit, and just having those sorts of conversations, which are really valuable. It also means, incidentally, that when you formally have to arrange a meeting, it may not occur, but informally it does, because you're seeing these people all the time. So it's a long way of saying that I don't think we'll ever or even should seek to replace face-to-face meetings as an opportunity with digital meetings. But digital meetings I see as being very, very valuable in between when you're actually getting together personally. But we wouldn't want to get into a situation where, for example, a prime minister had never met the leader of Japan or Korea or so on, because there hadn't been an opportunity. And the only engagement, you only ever met them on a screen. That's a long way from ideal. So I think we need some sort of optimal mix where we're getting the best out of our digital engagement, which is, easier to organise, but also not believing for a moment that that's a perfect substitute for face-to-face personal engagement.
No, and thank you, Craig and Tobias. I think it sort of highlights, that there's been transformation because of COVID, but also, it can't replace sometimes the importance of that human connection and those off-the-cuff conversations, which are somewhat harder to do, via a video call. And something that Tobias mentioned in briefly, and I want to sort of just focus on a little bit about this, is about the issue about fake news. Is as a nation in the region, how can we deal with fake news, and how can we combat digital misinformation across the Indo-Pacific region? So I may start with Tobias on this one, because you sort of mentioned it as a part of your previous sort of answer.
Yeah, look, absolutely, really important issue, and I think in bilateral exchanges, and certainly during time of those face-to-face meetings that I so frequently had, fake news issue, disinformation was often top of the list, or somewhere in the top 3 of concerns of many countries. And I think interesting example that Craig used there as well of thinking about some of the deep fakes that we're starting to see emerge now, which further confuses that environment. And let's be under no illusions, certain adversaries want the information space to be quite confusing, so that we don't know quite what to believe, and what information can be actually trusted information. So there's a big job for government here, but doing it in partnership with others in terms of upskilling, uplifting the user base of digital platforms. Let me start from the point of view that we know the most vulnerable people to any kind of negative activity online, whether it be criminal or disinformation, is first-time users. And we do live in a region where still approximately 50% of users are still yet to be connected online. So there's still a large user base that will be coming online and potentially more susceptible to what's going on. So, with that mix, again, is a complex mix which we need to address, and we have been. Now, the solutions aren't straightforward. I think many would like there to be a very simple technical fix that could fix the solution, and I'll tell you that I've been asked that many times in various meetings. Is there something technically we can do to fix this? And unfortunately, these solutions are complex in the sense that the best antidote to disinformation is producing and promoting accurate, transparent, and timely information from creditable sources. Therein, though, lies a problem that unfortunately, because of the situation we're in, government is a trusted source of information, but some members of the public won't want to listen to government. Therefore, you need to find partners who you can work with, and more often than not, that means working with the platforms A lot of the social media providers where a lot of disinformation is taking place, not entirely, but majority of that we see very publicly. And we need to work with the platforms to ensure that they are also, being responsible in producing, promoting accurate, transparent, and timely information from credible sources. And I think you're seeing this issue rear its head. So there's a certain amount of work that we do in various countries in terms of training the trainers, if you will, of those who will then go out in country and help train the public in terms of what good looks like in discerning creditable source material and where from. But also, we're in a situation now where many of the big tech platforms wield enormous power. And I know that sounds like a very straightforward thing to say, which we all know, but it's worthy of recognition that many of the platforms wield the kind of shaping of trends politically and in terms of power bases and the way that public perceive issues in a way which is akin to a major nation state. Therefore, one of the new areas of diplomacy, or one of the emerging areas of diplomacy of a position like this, is to ever more squarely be engaging with the tech industry to ensure that our equities are heard, that there is a clearer direction in the way that they are engaging in, especially this disinformation environment, but across a whole multitude of issues. A lot of multinational companies would like very clear single guidelines globally in terms of how they would operate. That's simply not the environment we're in, though, for very obvious reason. Many countries are not authoritarian in the way they view the world, and we have very liberal democratic views of how the online space should be managed and run. Therefore, it's a difficult conversation. One of the ways in which this position and a project that I devised with the Danish tech ambassador, who's based in Silicon Valley, is through something called the Cyber and Tech Retreat, where we, in private, take 25 positions like my own with very, very senior tech executives, many names which you would know very well, and talk one-on-one about specific issues to try and iron out some of the policy solutions that are required, but also trying to get ahead of the bell curve of what's coming next down the pipeline that we as policymakers need to be thinking about. So it's a very complex environment that we're dealing with.
So, thank you, Tobias. I'm just aware that the time is against us, and we've got a couple of questions posted in the Q&A. One question is, and I'll start with Craig, if you can briefly sort of give us your views, is where do you see the role of Australian universities in capacity building in the Indo-Pacific region?
If you look at the ratings of Australia's universities globally, they're pretty good, and we've got a number of them in the top, certainly in the top 50 universities in the world. So maybe it's a bit of national pride, but I think our universities do have good standing and integrity. So that's a start. That's a really important start. And the universities themselves, because they have that credibility, we're talking then about credible sources, because they have that. I think that there's a huge role for our universities to be as good as they can on cybersecurity, to have where they can, and we don't want every university to be top of the pops in cybersecurity, but we would want some of them to do that, and RMIT is a leader in that regard. That gives us the sort of credibility that we were just talking about, that governments aspire to, don't always achieve it, but at least aspire to. So I see, in soft diplomacy, our universities playing like a crucial role, because if you look at the range of potential actors, if you like, you've got governments and then ... universities, really, the way I see it. I don't know about other institutions. When I say governments, of course, I talk about the agencies, as various agencies as well. But really, there'd be no substitute for having excellence in our universities, building on the reputation that we already enjoy.
Thank you. And Tobias, what's your view regarding the role of Australian universities?
Thanks for bringing me in, Matt, and I really enjoyed Craig's answer there. For me, higher education institutes are an absolutely essential part of capacity building around the region. We work with a whole range of different Australian universities to uplift cyber capacity around the region, whether it's with the ANU through a range of cyber boot camps that we run around the region with various countries, which is basically teaching cybersecurity skills, policy approaches, the way that Australia engages with industry, how it organises itself across government. Whether it be Macquarie University, who delivered cyber simulations for us. We've just funded a whole range of different work through our Australia-India Cyber and Critical Operation Grant Program on quantum technologies, ethical frameworks in critical technologies, and a whole range of other issues. It's essential that we're working with universities because, again, the expertise that universities have, the credibility that universities bring to the equation, again, means that you can do things that otherwise you might not be able to if it was government trying to do similar things. Now, I acknowledge RMIT isn't yet one of those listed, but I'm always, and we as government are always open to growing our pool of trusted delivery partners. And that's something I've purposely done in this role, is tried to make sure that we're working with as broad range of partners as possible. We've worked with partners as big as Qantas Airlines, delivering a cybersecurity uplift across the Asia-Pacific over the course of 2.5 years, all the way down to tiny Australian small to medium-sized enterprises of maybe a handful of employees, because they deliver some very specific niche capability, which is vital for one of our partners. So I always have an open door, an invitation for new ideas, new thinking on how we can do this. And Matt, I was really excited to hear about your new centre in Vietnam. It sounds, what a fantastic initiative. And we're really excited to learn more about what the agenda is of that centre going forward, and how all of us can plug into such a good initiative.
Thank you, Tobias. We're going to finish up with a final question, and the final question is: apart from government, how can the private sector help in this cooperation? How can the private sector help to build relationships in the Indo-Pacific region? And I'll start with Tobias and then Craig.
Thanks, Matt. I think I started to get into that at the tail end of the answer I was giving, but again, it's really it's about having the private sector engaged now, not just in terms of the delivery arm, if you like, of helping build capacity around the region, and genuinely there's quite a long list of private sector companies that we've worked with to do that in partnership or in contracting arrangements. But it's also in the strategy process itself. And an anecdote I'll just give you. I remember when I first came into Foreign Affairs Department, and I invited many of the industry partners and senior leaders in Australia in to come and talk to me about what they think a position like this should do for Australia. And I think there was a bit of scratching of heads in certain colleagues because they didn't know who was I seeing. And I said, well, these are all the industry figures. These are the tech leads for Australia that I need to understand what are their interests? What do they think the strategic goals of a position like this should be for Australia? So we take that very seriously through all of our government work in this area of persistent engagement. And I don't mean persistent engagement in the way that some might in a more defense orientated conversation. This is about constantly listening, talking to those who are out with the capability in the conversations in and around the industry bazaars so that we understand what's going on there. And one of the most important arenas on that front that we're really acknowledging now inside government is the whole standard setting environment, which is very detailed, very difficult work. But industry are often leads in many of these groupings because they are not government centric. Some of them are, like the International Telecommunications Union, but places, other environments, whether it be 3GPP, ISO, the International Standards Organization, it might well be that governments aren't centerpiece of that conversation. They are part of it. So we need to be more engaged with industry to ensure that we're setting tech standards that are, to be honest, going to enable the kind of world that we want to live in. We know that certain other countries have industry who aren't quite industry and carry a very clear political favour into a conversation. And that's been the case in many of these standard setting organisations for some time. So for us, industry an integral part of both how we set our policy frameworks up, how we engage, and how we deliver.
Thank you, Tobias. And Craig, I wonder if you have a sort of a quick reflection.
As an economist, I think about markets, and there's a market for cybersecurity, and the governments provide a lot of that, generate a lot of it, but potentially it's very lucrative for advisory firms, just by way of example, to develop expertise and be able to offer that expertise around the region. It is said that a firm's or a business's reputation arrives slowly on foot and leaves in a Ferrari. In other words, if you get it wrong, if you don't have that credibility, one bad slip or poor piece of advice, that'll take you out of the market, because people say, oh, no, we can't deal with them. Remember that big incident that they stuffed up. So the market is kind of works in terms of demand and supply. There's a huge demand for these sorts of services, and supply can be, very valuable. You're not going to get hundreds of firms doing this, little small businesses, backyard operations and so on. You'll get reputable firms, so that there's a strong incentive for those firms to build their reputation slowly and make sure it doesn't leave in a Ferrari. And if they do that, they can do very well, and so can the region.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm afraid we're coming to the end. I'm afraid we weren't able to answer all the questions that were posted, but thank you for posting those questions. I'd really like to thank Dr. Tobias Ferguson for the time that he spent with us, and Dr. Craig Emerson for your time as well. I think that this has been such a useful discussion, really, to sort of unpick the strategy, the engagement strategy, but also to highlight where the future in the Indo-Pacific region is, and the role that Australia has, a key role that Australia has within this region. And I thank you so much for taking the time out of your very, very busy days to spend it with us to talk about this subject. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Pleasure, Matt. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd just like to sort of wrap up today's presentation. So as was mentioned before, next week we have our final webinar in the series that's talking about ransomware, and it's about how we can protect ourselves against the issues of ransomware and mitigate those types of attacks. If you're curious to find out more about our Centre of Cybersecurity Research here at RMIT, or about the College of Business and Law, and would like to find out more information, please reach out, and their details are on the screen now. Please reach out to Larky, the Deputy Director of our Centre, or Sarah, the Industry Relations Manager at the College of Business. Just drop them an email, and they'll be able to answer any queries with you. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending the seminar today, and as I said, sort of next week we have our final seminar in the series looking at the very topical issue of ransomware. Thank you everyone, and I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon.